Morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just going to allow Zoom time to add everyone, which often takes a good minute or so. So please sit tight. We'll get started shortly. Thanks. Good morning once again, everyone. We're just allowing some time for Zoom to add everybody to the room, which generally takes at least a minute. So please sit tight and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on society. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'll be moderating this event. The world is pinning its hopes on the development of a vaccine for COVID-19 to help end the pandemic. We have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss the challenges involved in validating, manufacturing and distributing a vaccine for immediate global use. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time and we will be sure to ask those later. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is Dr. Thomas Denny. He is Chief Operating Officer of the Duke Human Vaccine Institute. He's a Professor of Medicine and an affiliate member of the Duke Global Health Institute. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Also with us is Professor Ooi Eng Eong. He is Deputy Director of the Emerging Infectious Diseases Programme at Duke-NUS Medical School in Singapore, where he is currently leading a clinical trial of a vaccine for COVID-19. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And we have David Ridley, who is a health economist and a professor of the practice at Duke's Fuqua School of Business, where he is also faculty director of the Health Sector Management Programme. Professor Ridley, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, Dr. Denny, I'd like to start with you. The first thing we have to know before distributing a vaccine is whether it actually works. What kind of standards do we use for that in new vaccines?
Well, the first challenge with making a vaccine starts with pathogen identification. You have to understand what the pathogen is and the characteristics of that pathogen, whether it's a virus or bacteria, and then that helps govern what type of approach you take to make a vaccine. Once you have that understanding, you then begin to evaluate different approaches, whether it's going to be a protein, an RNA, or a DNA approach that you're going to pursue. And then typically what goes into the next phase is what we call a lot of preclinical work. So you develop a few candidate immunogens, and then you first start to look at in animal models to see if you can get a appropriate immunologic response. So what does that mean? That means generating antibody levels or generating different types of immune cells to elicit a certain function that would go out and destroy the organism. Once that progresses and you start understanding dosing and route of administration to get a successful response, one of the last phases of preclinical is to do what we call protection experiments. And these are generally performed in some animal model where you will vaccinate the animals a number of times, and then at some point you will then challenge them with the organism that you're trying to elicit a protection to. And what you're going to look for there is that hopefully the vaccine that you've developed at that point in a preclinical mode will protect those animals from getting infected and having, or if they do get infected, perhaps it's an attenuated course of infection. So the vaccine does help in some ways protect the ultimate development of disease. So that's the preclinical part of it. Once you get the preclinical part of it finished, you then start to think about how am I going to manufacture this? And what most people do at that point is they want to develop what's called typically a target product profile type of document. And you think about what dose it has to be, how much material you have to manufacture, how do you want to administer it? Is it an intramuscular injection? Is it can it be given orally? Can it be given like a nasal spray or something like that? And then all that guides the type of eventual manufacturing process that you will do. For most vaccines, you can spend anywhere from 6 months to 18 months in this so-called process development mode. And if you think of that as, think of it as a chef who is experimenting with a meal before he wants to put it on the menu for all his most important customers. So he or she will experiment with a lot of different ingredients. How do they get it to be just perfect? And then they will say, okay, this is now ready for prime time. So that's what we do in process development. We take these potential vaccines, we look at how we can get them to grow and produce at the quantity we have to get it to produce to. We look for the characteristics of it. What type of sugar profiles does this immunogen have? All these characteristics of that immunogen determine how it will interact with the host once it's administered. So we work through all this process development in a what we call it's in a very good design lab, but it's not at a manufacturing grade lab. And then once we get through that process, we write an extensive document that is called a tech transfer document. That then document goes over to our GMP team, which GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Principles. And that's where the team will grow and produce and purify this vaccine under extraordinary control conditions. There's a quality control team. There's an extensive amount of analytics that's performed. All this is done in very sterile conditions. When that product is made at the end of that point and purified, it'll go through an extensive amount of testing. And then the very final part of that manufacturing is what we call fill finish. And that is where we then take that product that we've manufactured and we've agreed that it meets all of the characteristics we set out for it to do. We then go to the process of putting it in vials that can then go off to the clinics or the hospitals or wherever this is going to be administered to people. And that's typical. We would hand that off to Eng and a team like his, who would then go ahead and do the clinical trial and see if does this vaccine in fact work that it was designed for.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you so very much for that comprehensive introduction. And there's a lot more to dig into there. But for right now, Professor Ooi, I'd like to move over to you. There are at least 30 clinical trials of different COVID vaccines underway across the world, and you are leading one of them. Can you tell us about the vaccine you're working on?
So we're working with a company based in San Diego called Arcturus Therapeutics, and the company basically uses a genetic material to deliver drugs for people with deficiencies and genetic deficiencies and like enzymes and things like that. But they also have a construct where they can use it to deliver vaccines. And in this case, it's the spike protein of the coronavirus. So if the name coronavirus suggests that it's shaped like a crown, right? Like what a king or queen would wear. And if you look at the crown from the top, you have all these spikes sticking out from the center circle and sometimes with the ball. And that's somehow what a coronavirus would look like if you do a microscopy of the virus. And so these spikes that are sticking out, it acts like a key for the virus to unlock, to get into the cell. And so that looks like a very good place for us to target the immune response so that if we can develop antibodies and perhaps also killer cells that target this part of the virus, then we could develop immunity against infection. So the vaccine that we're working on with Arcturus, therefore, is an RNA vaccine. So it's a genetic code of the spike protein stored in the form of RNA. But beyond that, unlike those developed by others like Moderna and all that, this RNA actually replicates in the body. That two reasons why I think that is good. One is that there's some level of dose sparing effect. You don't have to deliver so much RNA to begin with because it'll expand in the body. And two, the act of replication of the RNA simulates the viral infection because that's what the virus would do anyway. Once it gets into the cell, it wants to replicate its RNA so that it can make more copies of itself. And in so doing, it triggers a cascade of immune response that that will then cause our body to recognize that this is a viral infection. So we think that a replicating mRNA would simulate some parts of that process, and hopefully that will then generate a more virus-specific response. So that's what we're doing, and we're in the stage where, as Professor Denny described earlier, we're at a stage where we're finishing the preclinical part in all the animal studies. So far, the results look good, and we're heading towards a clinical trial in the next few weeks.
Gotcha, thank you. That certainly is very encouraging, and we've got lots of follow-up questions on that. But for right now, I would like to move on to you, Professor Ridley. Once we get a vaccine, can you give us a sense of what it takes to manufacture a vaccine on such a large scale for immediate global use, and what kind of timetable we should expect once one is actually approved?
Great question, Greg, and I'll build on the comments from Professors Ooi and Denny. So they both started off with talking about preclinical, and then Tom went into clinical, which typically takes about 7 years. And meanwhile, we're preparing to manufacture at scale. And that was your question about manufacturing at scale. Unfortunately, some of these vaccine makers are actually already manufacturing now. So for example, Sanofi said they're going to be able to make 100 million doses this year and 1 billion doses next year. That's really unprecedented, because usually you'd wait to see if your vaccine is having some success. If you think there's a 1 in 8 chance that you're going to get on the market and you're already spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars now, that's kind of crazy, but that's a crazy world we live in, and I salute them for it. So usually it takes years to manufacture, because you got to be welding miles of stainless steel pipes, and because you want to be sure that you got a good vaccine before you start making it at scale. So typically this is going to take, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Maybe now we can do it in 1 or 2 years. Part of this is going to depend on the appetite for these manufacturers to start building something now that they'll probably never use. And my guess is this will take longer than people assume, because there'll be a little bit of foot dragging. If you drag your feet a little bit longer and make sure it's a good vaccine, that it's going to work before you make the huge investments in manufacturing, you can save a lot of money and save yourself a lot of pain, especially since the prize being dangled for you is awesome. It's saving lots of lives, but it's not making any money. Most of these manufacturers have pledged they're not going to make money. So for them to go really fast on a vaccine that's probably never going to work is incredibly expensive. And maybe they can do that over the next year or two, but my guess is there's going to be a little bit of foot dragging, because it's so expensive to go fast on something that probably isn't going to work, because most vaccines that we test in people don't make it to market.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for your introductory answers. We're going to move on to questions now. And again, if you're joining us on Zoom, you can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can enter a question into the Q&A window. And if you do enter a question in the Q&A, I guarantee you we will get to it, so don't worry. If you're joining us by phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand, and we can unmute you so that you can ask a question. And to start off, Professor Ridley, I'd like to stay with you, because yesterday, Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of infectious diseases at the National Institutes of Health, testified before Congress. And one of the things he said was that the US government is bearing some of the financial risks so companies can ramp up manufacturing capabilities ahead of time. How much difference do you think that could make to the timeline that we're looking at?
I think it's really helpful that we have BARDA and that we've dramatically increased the budget for BARDA. So BARDA is sort of a government venture capitalist so it's giving money to drug and vaccine makers, so they have some resources now, so they're not losing a lot of money. I think that is going to increase the willingness of these manufacturers to go faster, because it's not everything's going to be a loss for them to get some money up front. Having said that, anytime you partner with someone, it's going to be difficult and potentially slow you down. So BARDA, the leaders at BARDA don't want to be called before Congress in a couple of years asked why the heck they wasted money on that awful vaccine that didn't have a chance anyway, or on that vaccine manufacturer that had connections to this person or that person, and that kind of smells fishy. So BARDA money can help a lot so that the manufacturers aren't as much at risk, but it also adds a layer of complexity because BART is going to still want to be reasonably careful. They're not just going to want to throw money at companies because 2 years from now, a senator is going to ask them, why did you waste $1 billion on those people when there wasn't a chance? And by the way, somebody at that company has a connection to somebody in the Trump administration, and that looks awfully bad.
Gotcha, absolutely. Always political considerations in these things, for sure. Professor Ooi, I'd like to come back to you. We have a question from Matthew Diazio, who's a reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer here in North Carolina. And he says, if the Duke-NUS Arcturus vaccine is approved, it would be the first RNA vaccine to get approval for human use. Are there concerns about being the first of this kind of vaccine to potentially scale up to global demand?
Well, it's a great question, actually. It will certainly be the first of the replicating mRNA vaccine to even get this far into clinical trial. And there is another one done by Imperial, and we'll see who gets that first. But I think essentially, you're right that there are some levels of unknown in there. But I think we understand RNA, at least in how we've used it in the lab and how we've used it in to deliver medicines, and those have come across with very good safety profile. So although there is some level of uncertainty, I think we are quite confident that given the kind of safety profile we observe with using RNA to deliver drugs, we should get a fairly decent safety profile as well. We think this vaccine will be tolerable and acceptable to the public.
Gotcha, thank you. And to follow up on that, my layman's understanding is that with these RNA vaccines, there are different methods that these vaccines can use to enter the cells, from using an electrical charge or a substance that can pass through the border of the cell. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your vaccine works in terms of entering a cell?
So Arcturus has a proprietary lipid nanoparticle system. So it packages the RNA just like a virus would package its own RNA genome. And that gets then delivered to the cells. And once it's inside the cells, the nanoparticles will uncoat, and that then releases the RNA into the cell, and that's where then the spike protein will be made. So that has the advantage, of course, is that, as I said, that it's a relatively simple delivery system, and it simulates some level of infection. But because the spike protein of the virus is made inside the cell, one is that it will get presented to the immune system to make antibodies, but because it's made inside the cell, another part of the immune system that generates killer cells will also recognize it, right? That here's what an infected cell would look like, and so then you get two arms of the immune system being activated: one to prevent infection through antibodies, two is to kill off the infected cells so that it doesn't spread. So that I think we at least in preclinical studies that's come true, that we can develop both arms of the immune response against coronavirus.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Dr. Denny, I'd like to come back to you. You lead the Duke Human Vaccine Institute, which got some funding from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases last year to study the feasibility of manufacturing a universal flu vaccine. Is there anything from that research that could be applicable to the manufacture of a vaccine for COVID-19?
Yes, and I'd also add to that within the last couple of years, we've had some DARPA funding, which was designed for pandemic preventions. And the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years has enabled us to develop a platform approach. It's an mRNA that we started frame shifting to several months ago to make a mRNA antibody response that would be for COVID. So the prior work experience and infrastructure that we have at the Institute has put us in a very good position to respond to this current challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Professor Ridley, I'd like to come back to you. Another question that we got from Matthew Diazio at the News and Observer. He says, what non-medical materials are also needed to properly distribute a vaccine? He said earlier this year there were reports of shortages of medical glass used for drug and vaccine vials, and concern about rubber stoppers for these vials. How much of a factor could that be, in slowing the manufacturing of the COVID vaccine?
It's a great question. And I think we've seen this problem, whether it's with toilet paper or PPE or supplies needed to scale up manufacturing diagnostics. We need a lot of materials in this process. Some are very simple, so gowns and masks are pretty simple things. Swabs for diagnostics are pretty simple things. Rubber stoppers, medical glass sound pretty simple, but we really have a high standard for those, because anytime there's something that's coming in contact with the vaccine that's going to go straight into your bloodstream, there are really high standards for sterility. So we shouldn't just think of, oh, glass is easy. We have real reason to be concerned about these. Yet another example is sterile water. Sterile water always seems to be in shortage. Water should be easy to make, but it has to be sterile because it's going straight into the bloodstream. And so we can't underestimate the importance of all these products along the line. And just as we've seen in other settings with PPE, we might be a little concerned about hoarding. So there's cost to scaling up PPE, there's cost to scaling up medical glass and rubber stoppers, and knowing that there might be shortages, someone might hoard those. One of the vaccine manufacturers, one of the hospitals might try to grab those materials. So the reporter's right to be concerned about that. There are all sorts of parts in this process, and if one of them breaks down, then it slows down the process of getting vaccines into people.
Absolutely, thank you. Another question that I think potentially all three of you could tackle, but certainly Professor Ridley and Dr. Denny. We expect that a vaccine, it seems like it's not clear whether a vaccine will provide lifetime immunity or just temporary immunity. Once we have one approved vaccine, do you expect that companies will continue to work in the background to try and come up with something better, knowing that the first vaccine may not be fully effective?
Absolutely, I do. I think that the duration of immunity post-vaccination is a major scientific issue that we're trying to understand. We're also trying to understand right now what's the duration of immunity after natural infection. And that will help us probably understand how well or how well not vaccines are going to perform for us. If we don't see good protection after natural infection, that is, if the duration is not long, then I think we're going to have some challenges. So that's a big issue. The other, I've talked about this in the past, and the approach, one of the approaches we're taking at the Vaccine Institute is we're also exploring the potential development of what we're calling a pan-coronavirus vaccine. So though we're dealing with this current pandemic, 10 years ago, we had SARS-1, which was in the family, but a bit different. And if you talk to the folks that understand, viruses and pathogens that are in animals that can hop to humans, there's a lot more behind this one that could cause the same problem. So one of the approaches we're taking is if we can develop a vaccine that would cover protection to all types of coronaviruses that may be a threat to us, we think that would be a big benefit. So that's a longer term goal for ours, and it's 18 months to 2 years out to having some prototypes there, but we're working aggressively to look at it. And that's, I don't think there are many that are playing in that space currently in their approach. Most are just looking at the short term COVID-19 pathogen and trying to get rapid vaccines developed for that one.
Sure, thank you. Professor Ridley, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think it's very common for the second product or a later product to be better than the first. Lipitor was fifth to market for the cholesterol drugs and was arguably better than the previous four. And also with vaccines, we now have Gardasil 9, which protects against 9 types of human papillomavirus. And it's better than the earlier versions of Gardasil. So I think it's reasonable to expect that later entrants will be better. Assuming the virus is still with us and still a threat, I would expect other companies to continue product development.
Gotcha. And I guess as a follow-up to that, can you foresee a situation in which we have competing vaccines on the market, and in the world there are concerns over people wanting this vaccine over that vaccine because it's been shown to be more effective, and that there could end up being almost like a kind of vaccine war kind of situation. I mean, is that scaremongering, or is that a possibility?
Well, I'll stick with the Gardasil example. So Merck had a Gardasil and GSK had Cervarix. Both are human papillomavirus. And eventually in the United States, we became convinced that Gardasil was a better product, and our young people are getting Gardasil jabs and not Cervarix, although GSK continues to market Cervarix outside the US. So it's entirely possible that one vaccine would be a bit better than another, and people would have preferences between those.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Ooi, we'd like to come back to you, have a couple of questions for you. One of them is that how much pressure do you feel to work as quickly as possible, given the current state of the world and the stakes and what it is that you're working on?
Yeah. No, obviously there's pressure. Obviously there's pressure from both the demand of public for a solution so that they can go back to some level of normality in their lives. Pressure also on their colleagues in the hospital saying that we need to deal with this, otherwise they'll forever be dealing with patients in isolation and all that. And also competition from other groups working in vaccines. I actually personally think that the competition is good because it spurs us to think harder, to come up with better, more innovative ways of doing things. So yeah, there is pressure, but I think some level of pressure is good for us to really push the boundaries.
Absolutely, thank you. And a follow-up question. And again, I know it's a kind of uncomfortable question, but it's a question every scientist being asked right now. What kind of timeline, do you see with this vaccine, with the mRNA you're working on, and when do you expect that this could be available for manufacture if it's successful?
Yeah, there are several parts to a clinical trial. I mean, the first part, of course, is to assess the safety and the tolerability of the vaccine. So what we do is you typically we start with a low dose and then we increase the dose until a point where we think that that's the sweet spot that we want to work within, and make sure that patients, whatever side effects that it generates, that can be tolerated by the vaccinees. That part is quite standard, so we can kind of predict what's going to happen. Once you get to the efficacy phase and ask the question whether this vaccine would work to prevent infection, that depends on how common the infection is at that time. So if the situation goes on as it is, then we shouldn't have any problems looking at efficacy. We can vaccinate the individuals and then ask whether that would then protect them from COVID compared to a group where they got placebo instead, right? But if for whatever reason the disease incidence or the prevalence of disease goes down, then it'll take us a much longer time to assess efficacy. So that part of the timeline is less certain. The one drawback, and I think Professor Ridley kind of alluded to this earlier, and Professor Denny as well, that although that we want to protect disease, we also need to ask the question: how long can we protect against infection? Because I think chances are we're not going to get rid of this coronavirus in a hurry. So it's going to stay with us, and so even if we can vaccinate people, protect them from infection within the first few months after vaccination, the question is how long will their immunity last? And so that is going to take an even longer time to figure out. So I think if we think about using vaccines in stages, then we could get one possibly into the, at the soonest, to me, would be about this time next year. I think any sooner than that is extremely optimistic, and I'm not sure that, definitely we're in unprecedented kind of timelines. Others have said that maybe they can get it by end of this year. I'm an optimistic person, but I'm not that optimistic.
Understood. Thank you very much. And before we move on, we've had another question come through specifically that's asking about the funding for the development of your vaccine. I know you're working with Arcturus. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's set up?
Yeah. So this work is funded by the government of Singapore to get started. And the part of the reason for that is because unlike in the US, Singapore does not have its own vaccine company. So we've always purchased all the vaccines that we use to protect our population. But in a situation like this pandemic, then sometimes even if you have the money to buy the vaccine, you have to stay in the queue, and so then that delays the time in which the Singapore population can get vaccine to protect itself. And so thinking ahead, what the Singapore government has done is looking at the various platforms, the various technologies. We thought that that this one could potentially give us a head start, because one, as I said, the RNA replicates in the body, and so you can possibly get away with a lower dose than if this wasn't a replicating mRNA vaccine. And two, because we funded the development, then we will get the first rights to the vaccine. So that's part of the reason why Singapore invested in this project.
Splendid, excellent. Thank you very much. We're about the halfway point here. I would remind reporters, thank you very much for those of you who have submitted questions. We will certainly get to all of those. And a reminder that you can submit questions via the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom, or hit *9 if you're joining us by phone to raise your hand in Zoom. Dr. Denny, I'd like to come back to you. Professor Ooi has explained this mRNA method that his vaccine uses. Can you tell us why that is a good approach?
I would say there are multiple approaches, and there are advantages and disadvantages, I think, of each one. And I think what's fair to do is in these early stages, when we're looking at approaches, I think we should be having multiple platform approaches to be able to evaluate them. So I guess I would look at it that I am happy that there are a number of different, if you will, mRNA approaches or vaccine approaches that are being pursued, because that's going to give us the opportunity to see which one does give us a more lasting or durable performance. The other part I'd like to make a note of, I think that we sometimes don't talk about when we're thinking mostly of prevention. The mRNA approaches for antibodies also present a potential treatment tool. For those folks who get infected, with influenza, we have Tamiflu that one can get and try to ramp down that virus. We don't have a lot of tools yet in the toolbox of antiviral agents for this pathogen. So in the short term, I think there may be some possibility, and I'd be happy to hear my colleagues' thoughts on that, but having some mRNA approaches that could be potentially used to administer to someone that is getting into difficulty, having high viral burdens, getting very sick, requiring ICU admissions, that this may be a way of trying to get the virus dampened down some, and this just becomes another tool in the toolbox. So I see the mRNA antibody approaches as twofold: one, protection, and then a potential opportunity for treatment modalities.
Gotcha. Thank you ever so much. Professor Ridley, would like to come back to you. Of course, people worldwide don't care how they get it, they just want a vaccine. But as you pointed out, vaccines are mostly developed by huge pharmaceutical firms that are set up to make money from the treatments they create. What happens when one firm comes up, or if one firm comes up with an approved COVID-19 vaccine? Do you expect they'll hold the world to ransom, or do they partner with other firms to crank out the kind of numbers we would need to vaccinate an entire planet?
Yeah, so if we have one vaccine manufacturer, what sort of prices do they charge, and how do they get to scale? None of the major vaccine manufacturers will charge ridiculous prices. They're in this game to try to do good, to try to impress their employees, to try to impress their shareholders. They're not going to accomplish that by charging ridiculous prices. I mentioned Gardasil and Cervarix earlier. Those cost about $100 a jab. Flu shots cost about $20 a jab. I think those are reasonable prices. Actually, Gardasil and Cervarix are more expensive than that now, closer to $200, I think. Although in poor countries, they're charging about $5 for each of those jabs. So I would expect prices below $100. These companies aren't going to want to embarrass themselves with ridiculously high prices. Your second question was, will they share? Can others manufacture the products? In the pill space, yes. So Gilead licensed drug makers in poor countries, generic drug makers in poor countries, to make their antiviral for hepatitis C. So Gilead licensed other companies to make their pills, but making pills is pretty easy. Making vaccines is not. So it's not a simple process to say, hey, you're welcome to make our vaccine. They can't immediately make your vaccine. They'll have to, for their facilities, I guess it depends on the vaccine, but I assume that for many vaccines, it would take a lot of time, take months or years for them to scale up. So I think the manufacturers, the really bad actors in the drug space over the years have been smaller players like Martin Shkreli at Turing, Valiant, smaller players that have not been in this business very long and don't have a lot of scientists within the company putting pressure on them to behave themselves. So I'm very confident that these manufacturers will behave themselves.
Gotcha, thank you. And another question, follow-up question that we've had from Sarah Kruger at WRAL for you, Professor Ridley. As we mentioned, Dr. Fauci testified for Congress yesterday, and he said that a vaccine could be available to the public by the end of this year. Do you think that's overly optimistic? And if so, why?
Dr. Fauci is quite optimistic. I think optimism's good. And my colleagues you can't see them, but I can see my colleagues nodding their heads. I think optimism has a really important role because we need people within these companies being optimistic, thinking we can get this done. If everybody sits back and talks gloom and doom like me, if everybody's a pessimist like me, nothing's ever going to get done. So I respect that optimism, but will you and I be vaccinated this year? No way. So I think it's entirely possible that a vaccine will be approved this year, but not at scale. We won't have a lot of doses of this. Sanofi's saying they're hoping to get to 100 million doses this year. Well, if you need two jabs per person, that can reach 50 million people, maybe, in a world with 7.8 billion people. So you can maybe reach a few people this year. But yeah, and don't forget, Sanofi is a French company, AstraZeneca is a British company. Don't just assume that we in the United States, there's 50 million people that are going to get jabs. Don't just assume those are all going to be Americans. So I think it's possible that maybe, I appreciate your optimism, we might have some people vaccinated this year, but the average person won't be vaccinated.
I agree. I think you got to have a coach. If you have a coach, if you're going into a tough game, you got to have a coach that's getting the team ramped up. So I think that's important. But I agree with you. I think the supply side of this, we may have some good science by the end of the year and think we have some leading candidates, but manufacturing them for all of us to have it administered, I think that's a tall order to be ready by the beginning of 21.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I think we can all agree that Dr. Fauci is doing noble work in very difficult circumstances. Professor Ooi, would like to come back to you. We've had another question. Your vaccine, if it's successful, could it be used in patients who are already infected, or would it only be a preventative measure for people who have not yet been exposed?
It's a great question, and it's something that Professor Denny, an idea that he threw provocatively. And at the moment, we're testing it as a preventative vaccine. We're not testing it as a way of seeing whether it could change the course of disease once someone's already sick with COVID-19. But it is an intriguing possibility. I mean, essentially, our fight against the virus it relies on the body to recognize, first of all, that it's infected with the virus, and then it triggers a series of processes. Initially, a very generic defense, not very specific to coronavirus. And then later on, the more specific defenses like antibodies and killer cells will then be generated. So it is entirely possible, theoretically, certainly, that because we're using an RNA vaccine, that the RNA and the vaccine will trigger the processes that would allow the virus to fight an RNA pathogen. So COVID-19 has evolved, SARS coronavirus has evolved mechanisms to escape that. Now, we've only had this virus for about 7 months now, so it's very early days. There's a lot that we don't know about this virus, but one of the early sets of data that's coming out suggests that this virus is somehow able to evade that immune response generically against RNA viruses. Now, if we then add an RNA in our vaccine into the body and that triggers this process, it may be entirely possible that then we elicit a response that the virus has evolved to escape from, or at least evolved to not trigger that alarm. And so essentially, we're relying on a vaccine to do that. I mean, think about it like a thief breaking into your house, right? And if this person is very skilled in overcoming your alarm, then they would be able to break in your house. But should you now have another system that then activates the alarm whilst the break-in is in process, then you would actually trap this thief. So it is possible, but certainly this is something that we'll have to explore experimentally before we take it to the clinic.
Gotcha. Thank you very, very much. Again, I'd remind everybody that if you would like to ask questions, you can submit them via the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom, and I promise we will get all questions asked. But we'll probably wrap this up fairly soon. Professor Ridley, I would like to come back to you. You've mentioned about, like, regardless of when a vaccine becomes available, it's not like everybody is going to get vaccinated immediately. And you've written recently about what we can expect in terms of when you're rolling out the vaccines, who should be first in line in terms of protecting vulnerable populations and making the most effective use of the vaccine when it's immediately available. So what kind of strategy would you expect to see as a vaccine is made available in terms of who would make the most sense to vaccinate first?
I'll tell you my preferences, but I'll defer to ethicists and other careful thinkers on the right answers, but I'll give you my answers. So first and foremost, health economists like me, I think, are the most important people in society. Maybe not, maybe we're at the bottom. So I think both healthcare workers and frontline workers, as well as vulnerable people. So everyone from the hospital to the nursing home to the grocery store, and seniors and other people with compromised immune systems, I think make the most sense to vaccinate. And sadly, we health economists may be at the bottom.
Gotcha, thank you. And if either of our other panelists would like to weigh in, if there's anything that you can add to that, then feel free.
I think we were just going to say those of us on the clinical sciences side were higher than the health economists, but we'll take that debate offline. Absolutely agree. Those underlying medical conditions and first line responders, hospital workers, they're the highest priorities that should be have access to. If we can't keep those folks going, then we're in trouble.
Understood. Professor Ridley, coming back to you, we've had another question for you. You mentioned the need for certain supplies, sterile water, glass, and so on, that might be in short supply and could hold us back. What can be done now? Is there anything that can be done now to improve availability of those supplies or encourage companies to ramp up manufacturing on that side as well?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't neglect them in terms of providing financial incentives for them to scale up. I think one reason why protective equipment has been slow to scale up is they've been burned in the past. So in previous epidemics, they scaled up and then everybody said, never mind. So, and they haven't wanted to do the same this time. So if you provide guaranteed contracts to them, so we pledge to you that we will buy this much at this inflated price. And it's reasonable, I think, to pay some inflated prices for these because these are not really expensive things. So offer some contracts in advance that we will pay for these. And this needs to come from governments and foundations rather than manufacturers, because there's a good chance that the manufacturers won't need or use them, because there's a good chance that any given manufacturer will fail in its development of a vaccine.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to move on to a final question here because we have one more question that I wanted to say for last. And so I'd like to hear all three of you touch on this. All three of you obviously work either closely within or adjacent to the world of vaccines, and it's an opportunity for a bit of public messaging. So in the last few years, we have seen a growing anti-vaccination movement. Of course, it's caused pockets of measles and other outbreaks in parts of the US and across the world. What would you say to people that might have some reluctance to embrace an approved COVID vaccine once it's available, given the current state of the pandemic? And whoever wants to take first crack at that can certainly do so.
So this has been an area that I've had a lot of interest in over the years, and just from looking at childhood vaccinations and people that are opposed to doing it today, and most of the people living today did not experience wild type diseases when they occurred, polio or a lot of other, and there are a lot of deaths and a lot of serious injuries and complications that occur from a lot of these diseases that are now preventable with vaccines. I think what we're living today is we're seeing how sick and how often there can be death from a new pathogen like this COVID-19. So I'm cautiously optimistic that people will weigh the benefit, see the potential of serious illness, sickness, or death of not taking it, and be motivated to want to be receptive to taking a vaccine for this. I think that's important messaging we have to communicate. But if you just look at the death rates and you look at the complications from this disease, I'm hoping that people will see that there is really an advantage to it.
Yeah, I would add to what Professor Denny said. I think whilst we have been doing a lot of science to develop the vaccine and all that, how we apply the vaccine, how we communicate the benefits of the vaccine, how whether governments actually pay for it, subsidize it, or we leave it to the public, all that matters in how we implement vaccination, and that was all that it will affect the take-up rate of the vaccine. I think one thing that we perhaps, if we were to be a bit more circumspect about what we've done in science, is that we have not really communicated, what we know about vaccine safety and all that to the public in ways that they'll understand. I think we've done a very good job in talking to each other in science, but in the language that very few others would follow. And I think we as scientists need to be better at communicating what we've found and what we're doing, and present the facts in ways that lay people would immediately grasp, rather than for others to rely on social media and all that to educate themselves. And very often these days, we then have to unravel the untruths at some point. So I think science needs to be a bit more proactive in reaching out to the public.
Thank you. Professor Ridley, anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. I think one reason why getting the vaccines to people might take longer than some expect is that FDA will be very cautious. So we have an incredibly high standard for vaccine safety because these vaccines are going into otherwise healthy people. So side effects are so rare with vaccines. And I think the same will be true here. The FDA FDA will not want to slow things down bureaucratically. FDA will be on this, having meetings as quickly as possible, gathering experts, looking through the data as quickly as possible. But FDA won't go so fast that it puts people at any serious risk. So I'm very confident that a vaccine that's approved will have very, very rare side effects, if any.
Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think we will call it there. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Ooi Eng Eong, Thomas Denny, David Ridley, for sharing your expertise and perspectives. Our next briefing will be at 11:30 next Wednesday, June 30th, when we'll be revisiting the steady increase of hospitalizations in the US from COVID and talking about what benchmarks communities should use to decide whether to reverse their reopening plans. If you'd like to be included in that advisory, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Please stay safe and stay well. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.